So one of the buzzwords in education right now has to do with executive functioning. And really the simple way to think about this is the level of control or the level of agency a student has over his own behavior. And we can think about this from a brain science perspective. And to really simplify things, we can think about the brain in three parts. And I wish I'd brought in a golf club. I don't actually play golf. But if I had a driver, right, we can imagine a driver. It's a stick that's the handle or the shaft of the club. And then the head of the club is like a big sort of bulbous thing. And I'm probably imagining one made out of wood because I really don't play golf. But that really becomes, we can think about the shaft of that golf club as our spinal column, and the base of our brain, the hind brain, the rear brain, or sometimes what we call the reptilian brain, is just like that head of a golf club. And so that exists right in the back of our head. It's the place that's most protected if we were to be hit in the head. And that's because all of the functioning in our body that's automated, right? We don't wake up in the morning and put our feet on the floor and say, okay, heart, remember to beat today, or blood, remember to pump, lungs, remember to breathe. All of those reflex activities that our bodies do to stay alive happen in that part of the brain. And then the next part of the brain moving forward is what we might call the mammalian brain. And so this is where memory is stored, this is where sensations are processed, and kind of think about the difference between having a mammal for a pet and having a reptile for a pet. I've never actually had a snake or an iguana. We did keep a snake in one of my classrooms for a while. And reptiles are such simple organisms that they can't regulate their own body temperature. And so really all they can do are those reflex things. Whereas I have a dog and a couple of cats, right? And it's very clear that my dog can show emotion and that he can remember things when I teach him tricks. And you can see sensory input as I talk to him. And so that's sort of that middle part of the brain. And then the front part of the brain we might call the neocortex or the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is where all this executive functioning takes place. And for students who have poor executive functioning, it's because the frontal lobe isn't fully developed. In our male students, we think that the frontal lobe isn't fully formed until they're about 27. I have a 20-year-old son. I have some years to get through here. But when students have sometimes behavior problems, the issue is that their executive functioning skills aren't fully developed. And so we have to have ways to accommodate for that, to essentially be the surrogate frontal lobe. This language comes from an author, his name's RossGreene, and his book is called The Explosive Child. There'll be a link to that below. I would highly suggest this book is one to read anytime a teacher or a parent comes to me and says, hey, I've got a student or a child and behavior is an issue. This is the book I always start with. Very rarely am I talking to teachers or parents who have behavioral needs that extend to that level, but I think this book provides a great baseline, even if your child doesn't have sort of explosive behavioral concerns. And RossGreene talks about this idea of being the surrogate frontal lobe. And the first point that he makes, I would also say as an aside, if you ever have the opportunity to go to a conference, or you principals have the opportunity to send your teachers to a conference where Greene is speaking, take that opportunity. He is an incredible person to listen to present. And he's a PhD MD. He teaches at Harvard Med, and he has a practice and works as a psychiatrist. And so the first thing he says that we have to do is we have to listen to our kids, right? It's the first thing about teaching. We have to have relationships with our students. And he uses two stories in his book and his presentation that I think are worth repeating. And so the first story that he tells has to do with the pot pie. And so he's working with a young girl in his private practice. And this girl's explosive behavior is that when she gets upset, she throws chairs out windows. And we're talking about, apartment buildings with 10 or 15 stories in Boston. And so throwing a chair out a window of a 14th story apartment isn't really a safe thing. And he's worked with this family for a short period of time, and he's had the mother kept some behavior logs and analyzed that data. And he comes to understand that Thursday nights are a particular hot spot. And Thursday happens to be the afternoon that the young person comes in for her sessions with Dr. Greene, which it's pretty low-hanging fruit to think that if you're going to your therapist and your behavior's off that evening, maybe the therapy is bringing something up. And so he just decides to ask her. And so they've had a session. Towards the end of the session, he says, I've been keeping track of your behavior, and it really looks like Thursday nights are a problem. And so I'm curious if you have any insights into why Thursday nights are hard for you. And without skipping a beat, the student says to him, Thursday nights are pot pie nights. And Greene's totally taken aback, right? This is completely different than his hypothesis. And he says, you don't like pot pies? She's like, no, I love pot pies. And she continues, have you ever had a pot pie, Dr. Greene? And Dr. Greene says, well, I was in grad school for a very long time. I've eaten a lot of pot pies. And so the student says, well, do you know when you take the pot pie out of the oven and you set it on top of the stove to cool down, and that top crust sort of falls into the gooey gravy stuff inside the pot pie? And Dr. Greene says, yeah, I actually love that part of it. She's like, I don't. I like my top pot pie non-soggy. And so he's a little puzzled and amused by this. And as therapy with children often go, he sees the child for about 40 minutes and then visits with the parents or the family, or in this case, the mom, for about 10 minutes before the session's over. And so he sends the girl out back to the waiting room where the toys are and brings the mom, and he says, okay, I've got something I want you to try, Mom. You can't ask me any questions. She's like, what? He said, no questions. And he says, so tonight's pot pie night, huh? And she's like, how'd you know? He said, no questions. And he said, tonight when you take the pot pie out of the oven, what I want you to do when you set it on top of the stove to cool, I want you to take a bread knife out of the drawer and a spatula, and I want you to cut off the top crust of her pot pie and set it on the plate and serve those two things separately to her. And that was the end of the problems on Thursday night. But who among us, when our kids are experiencing behavior, be it our kids at home or our students at school, do we stop and say, what's bothering you? And so we need to do that. And we need to listen to what our students and our children tell us, because sometimes they're able to identify and communicate what's going on. The other story that I really like from this book is the pizza story. I don't know why they're all about food. I don't know why all the food starts with P, but it's after lunch and I'm not hungry, so it works. So in this particular case, it's a young man, and he has a lot of meltdowns in the car and kicks the side glass out of the minivan window. And until recently, Boston was the one city in the United States I refused to drive in because the traffic there is nuts. And so the idea of kicking a side glass window out of a minivan in Boston traffic is pretty frightening. And so one day, and this particular mom and her son had been in therapy a little bit longer, and the kid's in the back seat of the minivan, and he starts screaming that he wants pizza. And mom's had some practice being the surrogate frontal lobe, and she says, I hear you telling me you want pizza. I don't have any pizza in the car right now. I do have some crackers in my purse, and if you're hungry, you can have those. If you're still hungry when we get to our appointment, we'll get something out of the vending machine outside the office. And you know what? I don't really have anything planned for dinner tonight. If you want to pick up pizza on the way home, that'd work out pretty well. That mom knew that when her son was screaming, I want pizza, what he was really communicating was, I'm hungry. And so she'd worked with Greene long enough, she'd been a part of this long enough to be able to ask herself, what's being communicated here? And so instead of saying, we can't have pizza right now, we're in the car driving down the street on the way to an appointment, she responded to the student's actual need, the fact that he was hungry, and said, I've got some food for you to eat right now. And if that's not enough, here's when we can get food again. And, if you're not going to kick the side glass out of the window, picking up a pizza on the way home is a pretty cheap alternative, right? So it's listening to our students, and it's being that surrogate frontal lobe. And the fact of the matter is, for us that work with kids or have kids that are more on the extreme side, not even the most extreme, but more on the extreme side, what we have to come to understand is that we may have to be that surrogate frontal lobe for a long time, right? Maybe with all first graders, but maybe with, 6th, 7th graders, high school students, we still have to do that. And so for me, it's important to have a method where we can talk kids through decision making. And you sort of think about this. Who do we talk to when we have to make decisions or something challenges us, right? And I know that, and no offense to my dad, he's great, but my dad isn't always the person that I call if I have a decision to make, right? And this may be true of a lot of our dads, because sometimes dads, and I do this too, sometimes dads, when presented with a problem by a loved one or their child, they present back a solution. And it's our solution as a dad, from my perspective as a dad, and it may not really be a good solution for my daughter, right? And so who do we call to process things? And I like to call my grandma. My grandma was the kind of person that would say, "What's going on?" And I'd tell her. And she'd say, "What do you think you ought to do about it?" And I'd tell her. And she said, "Well, it sounds like you've got this all figured out." And I just left those conversations feeling great that I had figured something out. Did she do very much? No. Did she offer a solution? No. But she listened. And so one of the methods, and I'm stealing this from some MANT training. This is a training, a de-escalation training. The method that I like to use was called S.O.D.A.S. So it's S-O-D-A-S. S.O.D.A.S. Situation, options, disadvantages, advantages, solutions. We can probably put that down in the link, but we'll do it one more time. S.O.D.A.S. Situation, option, disadvantages, advantages, solutions. And this becomes sort of a mnemonic device and a problem-solving method that when you have students you're working with, that you can sort of talk them through. I remember one day when I was a principal, a fifth grader kind of came screaming into my office. And the second greatest secretary in the history of the world, Carol Towns, he buzzed right by her and says, "I got to see Ramsey, I need a soda." And I think Carol Towns thought I was giving kids Mountain Dews, because kids would constantly come to the office asking for a soda. Little did she know they had problems they wanted to solve. And so on this one day, this particular gentleman buzzed out of Miss St. Clair's fifth grade classroom and came into my office and was just upset. And I said, "Well, what's going on?" And we'll call him Billy. "What's going on, Billy?" And Billy says, "Well, I'm in Miss St. Clair's class and it's math time and I don't want to do math and she wants to make me do math." Okay, so let's talk about that. This is the situation. It's math time. You're in class. Your teacher wants you to do math. You don't want to do math. And that's the situation. It's the first test of the S.O.D.A. And so the next question was, "So what are your options?" And he said, "Well, I'm in here right now." And I said, "That's true, but you can't stay in here. So what are your other options?" And he said, "Well, I don't want to go back to class because I don't want to do math." Okay, but going back to class is an option. "Well, yeah, but I'm not going to because I'm not going to do the math." And I said, "What's your other option?" He said, "Well, I could go to Mr. Rick's room." Mr. Rick was actually a former NFL player that we hired to run our recovery room. And he didn't want to go to Mr. Rick's room because Mr. Rick would make him do a behavior sheet and identify what was going on and have a conversation, and he didn't want to talk about it. So his options were to go back to class and do math, which he did not want to do, and go to Mr. Rick's office, which he also didn't want to do. And so those were the options. And I said, "Well, what are the disadvantages to those options?" "Well, I don't want to do math." And that had been made very clear. And I said, "Well, what about Mr. Rick's room?" "Well, I don't want to do all those sheets and talk about how I feel about things. I don't want to be in there forever. I want to go to recess." And I said, "Well, what is it about recess?" And he goes, "Well, I haven't talked to Johnny all week. I want to talk to Johnny at recess." I said, "Okay, so what do you have to do to go to recess?" "Well, I got to do my math if I'm going to go to recess." Okay. So we have the disadvantages. What are the advantages? And he said, "Well, I guess the advantage of going back and doing my math is that I get to talk to Johnny, and the advantage of going to Mr. Rick's room is that I don't have to do my math. And I don't want to do my math. I'm not doing my math." "But you really want to talk to Johnny?" "Yeah, I need to talk to Johnny." And so then we talked about the situation, we talked about the options, we talked about the disadvantages, we talked about the advantage. And, pretty soon he looked up and said, "Fine, I'll go do my math." And he walked back to class. And that probably took all of about 5 minutes, right? We had a soda. We talked about the situation, what his options were, what were the pros and cons, and he arrived at a solution. Now, not every time I had a problem-solving conversation did it go that well. That is a good example. But I think it's handy to have that structure that you can teach to students. And even though we can predict that we're going to be that surrogate frontal lobe for a long, long time, my thinking is that if we have this model, that eventually the kids might think in their own mind, oh, what is the situation, right? That we've taught them a habit that they can use for problem solving later on. So that's my thinking about executive functioning and how we need to create that relationship. We need to listen to students, and I don't think S.O.D.A.S is the only option for a problem solving acronym for students. I'm sure there's a lot of other ones, and maybe your school building within your school behavior management plan has a different model that you use, and you should use that one. But I do think it's important to have at least one way to talk to students through the problems that they're having.